everyone. We are going to do the impact of Bill 22, which is in its first stages. There are a number of regulations that are coming in probably in the fall and the spring that will better clarify information, but we thought it was important at this time for everybody to understand what the implications of Bill 22 are. So welcome, Jennifer. Thanks so much. And Jennifer's contact information is on the screen. So if you have any additional questions afterwards, you're very welcome to contact her. We'd just like to say a note of thanks to Associa, who provided sponsorship for this event, as we do for all of our webinars. So just a shout out and a note of thanks for them for their sponsorship. Again, also just a little privacy note with respects to any questions that you may pose or any information. Please don't use any personal or identifying information of your Strata Corporation. So Jennifer, all the way over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tony. So as an EV enthusiast, I can say this legislation has been a long time coming, but in my opinion, it's quite a good piece of legislation. I believe that the government very carefully considered it, and I know they consulted experts. So let's take a look at the legislation. I titled this first slide, "The Right to Charge." I use that phrase somewhat reluctantly. The term right to charge means different things in different jurisdictions, and in my opinion, different jurisdictions have had different levels of success with the phrase right to charge. Here in BC, the Bill 22 became effective on May 11th, 2022. As Tony mentioned, certain parts are effective right away and some are coming later by regulation. The next slide, Tony, is really something visual here. Really, I'm trying to just catch your attention. I'm not suggesting or recommending any vehicle EVs. I'm not selling any either. So next slide. Let's look at what the legislation is about. First and foremost, I think this is really quite important. There's a change in the threshold to approve for a vote for various things. So it changed from 3/4 vote to a majority vote for a significant change in the use or appearance of common property. I think that's quite significant. I've, over the years, done a lot of work with Strata corporations and electric vehicles, and I've heard lots of stories about Strata councils that really didn't want to put in electric vehicles. And with this change, I think it's going to be more likely that Strata corporations can put those kinds of changes through. In my opinion, installation of an EV charger for the first time very likely is a significant change in a user appearance of common property, and you need a resolution. The other thing that changed is the threshold to approve an acquisition of personal property. That's under Section 82 of the Strata Property Act. And the third change was the threshold for use of the common CRF for EV infrastructure or electrical planning reports. Now, I had a couple of calls this week from people complaining to me, and just note, I'm not the government. I'm not the person to complain to, but there are some people who are quite concerned that this change wasn't related to a special levy. And I think this is important. I personally wasn't that surprised that the government didn't change the threshold for a special levy to a majority vote instead of a 3/4 vote. And I'll tell you why. The BC government for some time has really tried to create incentive for Strata corporations to increase the CRF. And we saw that as well with depreciation reports, where if a Strata corporation has a repair that's set out in a depreciation report, they can approve that repair by 50% vote. So it didn't surprise me that much, but I think the important thing to remember, Strata corporations that prepare and that have a significant CRF in place have a bit of an advantage with respect to approving EV infrastructure. So the next slide, Tony, is this is Section 71. We talked about that a little bit already, but this is the change from a 3/4 vote to a majority vote for a significant change. Next slide, Section 76. This is the language. We already talked about this as well. Oh, we didn't talk about this. This is actually related to exclusive use of common property. And I think this is quite important because in the early years, I was quite concerned personally about how Strata corporations that have common property parking stalls would be able to have some permanence to Strata to owners who wanted to install EV infrastructure. So for example, I used to live in a strata corporation many years ago. We had one parking garage. Everybody had their stall, but it was common property. And so nobody really had permanence to the stall that they were using. I don't know what they would do if one person installed a charger, because that person wouldn't have certainty that that they would be in a position to continue to use that charger, and probably most importantly, to be able to transfer their strata lot to a buyer with knowledge that the buyer would be able to use that charger as well. Now for this one though, we have to wait for the regulations because we don't know the period of time for which the government's going to let strata corporations grant use of common property. Next slide, please. This is this is for the acquisition of personal property. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but I think the understanding really is that the government was envisioning that strata corporations may want to install chargers in common property. And if that's the case, you only need a majority vote in order to approve that change. Next slide, please. So I think this is one of the most important changes. And I think over the last sort of decade, I've heard a lot of stories about strata corporations that have been making it difficult for owners to get approval for installation of EVs. This is an important change because an owner is entitled to request approval, and the strata corporation is going to have to consider it. Now, there's a lot to be determined by the regulations, and we'll talk about that at the end as well. Next slide, please. So this is the obligation of the strata corporation to respond to a request from an owner. I happen to know that the BC government is in the process of considering the regulations. It's not probably going to come out tomorrow. If I was a betting person, and I'm not, my bet would be, and I have no knowledge of this, but I suspect probably sometime in the fall we'll see regulations come out. Okay, so this next slide is related to what the strata corporation must do upon a request from an owner. So the strata corporation must approve if the owner has a right to use the stall, if the infrastructure is in a class as set out in the regulations, and other criteria as set out in the regulations. So I think we know, based on some of the changes, for example, changes to age restriction bylaws that we saw in December and later based on the regulations in May, we know the regulations can significantly change the legislation that came out. So I'm not like I said, I'm not a betting woman. I'm not going to bet and predict what might come out, but I think it's important for owners and strata corporations to be aware of that regulation when it comes forward. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here are the things that the strata corporation can consider. So compatibility with existing infrastructure, and a system to manage energy. I think that's often referred to as throttling or energy sharing. Next slide. And this is what the strata corporation can require. And this is why I think this legislation is quite balanced, because it does create rights for owners, for EV owners and owners of strata lots, but it also creates a lot of protections for the strata corporation. So they can require that they have to approve the contractors, approve the materials. They can require modification or replacement of EV charging infrastructure. And they require an owner to accept joint and several liability with other owners installing EV infrastructure. Next slide. This comes down to the fact that the owner is responsible for costs unless otherwise agreed. So again, I think there's some flexibility here that the BC government has built in. Traditionally, strata corporations like to make owners responsible for repairs and costs. But now what they're saying as well is that the strata corporation has the ability to make the alteration and either require the owner to pay for that or otherwise agree to something else. Lots of flexibility there. Next slide, please. This is a change in the legislation that allows, that confirms that if you're an EV owner, you don't get better access to parking just because you own an EV. This is something that I was really pleased to see here, because my experience has been that sometimes strata corporations and EV owners are in conflict, with strata corporations being suspicious that the EV owners are trying to get something that they're not entitled to. This, I think, is important because it clarifies that just buying an EV doesn't give you the right to park on common property. Next slide, please. Now, this is the electrical planning report, and I think this is really important as well because it really encourages owners to do, or strata corporations to do planning. And so even though there is a change to the legislation, it still enables strata corporations to be clear and to make sure they're making prudent choices. And the planning report is where it starts. This is very similar to the requirement regarding depreciation reports. You see it follows a similar pattern. We've got the qualified person. We've got the dates by which the report must be obtained. That's going to be set out in the regulations. And then we've got, we know it's coming. My experience has been that there are some strata corporations who are trying to get in touch with service providers now, knowing that there's going to be a requirement to do it. And I think this is really to avoid a rush. I don't know, Tony, if you want to comment on that, whether you think that there's a rush for these service providers and whether there are going to be enough people to perform this work.
We don't really know what the implementation cycle is going to be yet. So, I think we'll encourage government to give everybody a 1 or a 2 year period, which will also give the industry a period to be able to ramp up, because we certainly will have a technician supply problem with respect to these investigations.
That's my thought as well. Now, we don't know yet what's going to be required in the report. So I know there are some strata corporations that are trying to find the service providers now, and I think that's an excellent idea. But we don't know whether what the service providers will provide is going to be consistent with the regulations. And that might be a bit of a gamble for stratas that want to get ahead of things.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing that capacity is much a problem within townhouse and bareland strata communities as it is in older mid-rise and high-rise buildings, because they are still subject to one distribution transformer for their community, and they may already be at capacity. The other challenge is with barelands and with townhouses, many of them have converted over from gas furnaces for heating over to heat pumps, which has already substantially increased demand in their community. So,
Yes.
all these different technologies have to be considered as future conversions with respects to capacity.
Yeah, I am pleased though that the government seems to be anticipating these things and thinking ahead. So I think that's solid. Next slide, please. I talked about this a little bit already, but this is the critical aspect. So paying for EV infrastructure, now all you need is a majority vote rather than a 3/4 vote. But again, it only applies to use of the CRF, not to a special levy. I know that's very disappointing for some.
Well,
Next slide, please.
I was going to say on that note, though, we did resolve that with one community who they barely missed their 3/4 vote, but their AGM was a month later, and they had already been planning this. And so they just had their AGM last week, and they approved the amount that they're going to need in their annual budget as their CRF contribution, and at the same time approved by majority vote their CRF expense to be able to do their electrification. So, there is kind of a go around.
Well, there certainly is, and I think that the government was really practical as far as setting this out. It creates incentive for strata corporations to start putting money into their CRF, and we know, Tony, because we deal with strata corporations all the time, there's a huge benefit for strata corporations that do that. No, the next slide is the last one, actually, and I just wanted to really put in a plug for the CHOA Journal, Summer CHOA Journal. There's going to be an article on this topic. This is just a summary. This slide is a summary of the things that are yet to be determined in the regulations. As I mentioned, those are coming at some point. We don't know when.
There we go. Jennifer, thanks so much. So everyone hold on. I see your questions in the Q&A, so we're going to pop through those, but we're going to get Binapal here is going to join us. There you go, Binapal, you can share your screen and do your presentation for us. That would be superb.
All right, so can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly well, thank you.
And apologies, I was having technical difficulties earlier. I wasn't able to
It wouldn't be a perfect Zoom meeting with or a webinar without a technical glitch. So,
Of course, right? So, okay, let's see. Can we see my slides?
yep, that's just perfect. Thank you very much.
So thanks to everyone. Thanks for Choa for letting us speak to you folks today. Here just to speak to the low carbon fuel standard, specifically around electricity supply. My name is Vinipal Gill. I'm a senior policy advisor with the low carbon fuels branch here at the BC government. Prior to the low carbon fuels branch, I did a lot of work around building charging infrastructure, including rebate programs that Strata is able to take advantage of to install charging stations.
We'll just get you a little closer to your mic or get you to speak up a bit. That would be great.
Okay, so how's this? Better?
Perfect. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So low carbon fuel standard, it is designed to reduce our impact on fossil fuels. It's been one of the most successful approaches to reducing greenhouse gases. It's expected to have one of the biggest impacts on our targets. So it is an important piece of the climate action strategy. So just quickly agenda, we're going to speak about what is LCFS, reporting electricity supply, the credit market, and having folks having representation, understanding that there's various reasons why you want that. And just quickly, some market barriers. I think it's understood that fossil fuels continue to dominate the market. They're low cost. We're reliant, they're reliable. We know that they'll do what we need to do. And then at the same point, there are limitations to adopting the new technology, associated with cost, what is the readiness of it, what type of production capacity is out there. So low carbon fuels is trying to address these barriers. If you have time, you can take a look at the regulations. It is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, specifically the renewable low carbon fuel requirements, and the renewable and low carbon fuel requirements regulations. So you can see those on bclaws.ca, or you can head to our website as well. So how it works, as mentioned, it's designed to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and the impact of transportation sector on the environment, and to spur the growth of cleaner fuels, lower carbon fuels. And it does that by having two real main pieces to it. One is it has a minimal renewable content, which requires diesel and gasoline suppliers to have a set amount of renewable content in that fuel. And then there's also the annual carbon intensity targets, which is more relevant to our conversation today here. And so through that, what happens is fuel suppliers that supply low carbon intensity fuels can generate credits. Those who supply high carbon intensity fuels generate debits, and it turns to the trading system where it's traded for monetary value, encouraging the transition to a low carbon fuel. So we're focused on part 3 of the Act, which applies to diesel, gasoline, and their substitutes, that could include propane, natural gas, and of course electricity. So fuel suppliers must meet this carbon intensity target set by the LCFS. If they don't meet it, if they're above it, they're going to generate debit. Electricity can only be identified as a Part 3 fuel when it's supplied through a charging station or other equipment that is the final supply equipment. For most of us here, we're thinking EV chargers for sure. There are other worlds where if you're thinking about like ships and shore power, where maybe an EV charger is just a little different. So we use the term final supply equipment. Electricity is a low carbon intensity fuel, has low carbon intensity, so it's a credit generating fuel. And just how we establish carbon intensities of each fuel, we take in the life cycle of it. This is an example of like ethanol or renewable diesel, where you can see there's considerations around land use and transportation and production of the fuel dispensing, and what's being emitted when it's being operated. And that's what, and from that we get a grams per carbon dioxide per megajoule for the different types of fuel. This is just a graph to show how electricity will be a credit generating fuel for some time. So the blue line is diesel, the orangey line is gasoline, and so that is the carbon intensity that's set each year. So for example, 2022, you see it around the 80 level. Each year that declines up until it's 30% below 2010 levels by 2030. But as you can see, electricity, which is 19.73 grams per megajoule of carbon dioxide, is going to be well below that. There can be changes over the years on our formulas, but we do expect electricity to be generating credits for some time. So what does that mean for, I guess, Strata corporations? So up until, I guess, 2022, this should be up into including December 31st, 2021, actually, that first statement there. So the electricity and fuels in general that are supplied under the low carbon fuel standard, to be the Part 3 fuel supplier was generally the person who sold the electricity for use in transportation. So if you think electricity, that's going to be the utility, really, because they're the ones who are selling the electricity. But beginning January 1st, 2022, there's more information on this in Bulletin 20 on our website. The final supplier is now the person who provides the electricity through the final supply equipment, except in a few circumstances, which is in residential dwellings with less than 5 units, and for some TransLink trains and trolleys that were in operation pre-2021. So this means for any residential building with at least 5 dwelling units, the person who's providing the electricity, so the person who's the utility account holder, I'm assuming that's a Strata organization in many of these instances here with Strata corporations, would be considered the Part 3 fuel supplier and would report that electricity supply. So here's just a quick example. You can see that there's 5 row houses here that if they're in a strata or if not a strata, they are considered the Part 3 fuel supplier. So it works with stratas that are condominiums and townhomes. Single family homes, though, are not covered. They would be under the utility, as would condominiums and townhomes that have less than 5 attached dwelling units. So that's how the legislation is being interpreted. So to report on electricity supply, you must be able to quantify the electricity accurately with reasonable accuracy. So we do require you to either use some sort of measuring tool, such as separate metering, or also you can use EV chargers that have data management capabilities, chargers that can track the electricity consumption that's going into the vehicle for charging. Compliance reporting, it occurs, each compliance year is the calendar year. So we're in the 2023 calendar year, and compliance reports must be completed by March 31st of the following year. So for this year, that's March 31st, 2024. Everything is done through our transportation fuels reporting system. It's an online tool where you can trade credits that get validated, and all your reporting would be done through that tool. We have staff here to support you through the process. Our mailbox I'll try at the end as well as lcf@setcap.bc.ca. Reach out early if you have any questions. We can strive to get you set up on time. Inaccurate, incomplete, or late reporting can result in penalties. Understanding we are in a learning phase, so we're not like threatening you with penalties at this point, for sure. Reporting electricity supply is actually very straightforward. I would just want to highlight that. So first thing you need to do is identify if you're a Part 3 fuel supplier. Are you the person who's paying the electricity bill associated with the final supply equipment, the EV charger? You are the Part 3 fuel supplier. Again, if you're in a building that's at least 5 attached units. You must have a BCE ID account. So For a Strata, I believe you select other as you're going through the process of selecting what type of business you are. Once you have a BCEID account, you email our mailbox. You complete a final supply equipment form, which is where you list all your EV chargers, and you mail it into our mailbox, and we'll get you set up in the transportation fuels reporting system and so you'll be able to begin your reporting process. Here's just a quick example of the final supply equipment form. It's basically asking for, just kind of where it's located, the serial number on it, just so we can ensure we're not going to be getting into double counting in any situations. Reporting in TFERS, just to highlight how straightforward reporting actually is once you're in TFERS. For example, you need to just select the fuel type. So if you're supplying electricity, it's going to be electricity. And then you want to select which fuel you're replacing, gasoline or diesel. Being in a Strata, I would assume it's going to be gasoline, considering the vehicle types that people are driving for the personal vehicles. And then you want to enter the total energy supplied for EV charging. And it's as an aggregate. So you're not going to do it for 10 different chargers. You're going to enter the line item for all chargers. And an example here is 20,000 kilowatt hours of electricity replacing diesel. So this, actually, no, this is gasoline, sorry. That should be gasoline. Generates 18 credits. And so that's about 8 to 10 passenger vehicles that are traveling 15,000 kilometers a year. And they're doing all their charging basically at home. Just an example of how straightforward it is to report. You just need to really punch in the kilowatt hours and know the fuel class and fuel type that you're replacing, and it'll automatically calculate the credits for you. So now you got credits. So what happens now? So fuel suppliers generate credits for, as mentioned before, for supplying fuels above the carbon intensity targets. They generate debits for that, and you generate credits for supplying fuels below those targets. Once validated by the statutory director, the credits are issued into your TFERS account. At the end of each compliance period, suppliers must have a balance of 0 or more credits to be in compliance. This means the people who are in debit will be looking for people with credits so they can avoid penalties. Credits can be traded amongst the fuel suppliers and banked for future use, as credits don't expire. So just a little bit on the credit market. It's a place where credits can be traded amongst the different suppliers, as mentioned, generally with people who are supplying low carbon fuels, with those who are supplying higher carbon fuels. Bulletin 13 on our website has a list of fuel suppliers, so you can see who is looking to purchase credits. It is a little dated. We are in the process of updating it, and we are also looking at adding people who can act as aggregators, so who can represent you, and that'll be important as I get to in a moment, because the credit market might be challenging for people with small amounts of credits to actually participate in. And again, credits are traded amongst public fuel suppliers, and it must be approved by the statutory director. So we have a credit market report that's published monthly. As you can see, for, I guess, last year, it looks like this is from, credits are trading in the $400 to $460 range, up as high as almost $500. We are expecting to see a credit shortage for some time, so we don't expect those prices to go down anytime soon. If you had those 18 credits, that would translate into approximately $8,000 worth. Again, the challenge I wanted to speak about is that historically credits have been transferred in large quantities. We are starting to see a shift to smaller transfers. So we're still in these early stages, still trying to see what's going to happen with the market with this. And again, we're expecting a credit shortage for some time. But would like to say that there's really 6 or 7 large fuel suppliers who are looking for credits, and so they're looking for a significant amount of credits, usually thousands. But as mentioned, we are starting to see some smaller transfers. You can see how the credit market has progressed here. There's more and more credits being traded each year as there's more demand for credits. So to speak to the part of the challenge of offloading credits, if you've got just a handful of credits, that can be really challenging. If you have 10, 20 credits, a fuel supplier that's looking for thousands of credits might not be, you know, even talking to you. So we have other options here that we've created. Under the current legislations, we are limited. We are in the process of amending the legislation to improve things. But first, we'll just speak to what we have, which is third-party representations, which a supplier can appoint someone to act on your behalf. And this person can then work with a fuel supplier and collectively negotiate the sale of credits. So instead of selling just 10, 15 credits, you know, they're working with a bunch of suppliers, representing a bunch of suppliers and selling them in a larger quantity. We have two pathways right now, and there's the aggregator pathway, which you have to be a Part 3 fuel supplier to be that. The other pathway is being an agent, which is when you're not a Part 3 fuel supplier. So the aggregator uses these reporting tools outside of our reporting system. And you just need to complete a form to demonstrate that you're representing somebody. You send these tools to our mailbox, and all the credits of those suppliers that are being represented are now transferred into that one person's account, and then they can be traded collectively. It must be reminded that all legal responsibilities are still the responsibility of the Part 3 of the Part 3 fuel suppliers. You're not passing on responsibility. The other option is if the person is not a Part 3 fuel supplier themselves, so they don't have a charger that they're supplying electricity through. We are seeing a lot of people move into this space. This is a business opportunity for people. And I think most people who be represented have used this route as well, even though it is a little, there's pros and cons in both. Like I said, with a little bit of legislation, but in this form, again, you need to have a representation agreement to show that you're being, show the agreement. Unfortunately, in this agreement, though, each supplier still will need their own TPERS account. So the person representing you is going to be working within each person's account and transferring the credits to everybody. Like, if they can collectively sell the credits, but they're going to have to transfer each credit individually from each account. Again, legal responsibilities do not change. You can't pass them. And credits will need to be transferred individually, as mentioned. Going forward, we're looking to streamline this process and have allocation agreements, hopefully for the next compliance year, 2024. In that period, we are looking to have a system where you can just have one agreement and then you're actually passing over legal responsibility, and it can be to any person. And this person can then trade credits from all their suppliers. If they don't need TPERS account from everybody, they don't have to report on anybody's behalf. They just need to have a record showing that they're responsible for those specific charging. We're still in the works of figuring this part out, so we will follow up with further engagement once the amendments have been finalized. This person can have multiple agreements with multiple organizations to aggregate credits. And the intent is to provide a more streamlined process to generate and sell credits. Just a couple more slides to get through here. Yeah, this was just so it means that this is for next year's compliance year, and will be for the deadline for that will be 2025, March 31st. This is just a quick graph to show the differences of representation. You have the agent and the aggregator. Basically, they both have limitations. The 2024 and beyond option is looking to kind of take the best of both worlds, where you can just, anybody can be the representation. They're taking on legal responsibility. All the reporting is done through our reporting tool, and they can transfer credits collectively. The final thing I just want to mention is, as it is still something that's new. This was the first year we had electricity suppliers that technically weren't the sellers, weren't utilities. And so we're still kind of going to be seeing how the market unfolds. But like I did mention, a smaller amount of credits might be difficult to unload. So we do have those aggregator options where somebody can represent you and they're getting good at it, so they're going to be able to help you do that. With that, though, they might take more of the revenue. So I don't know how sector stratas actually work together, if at all. But one thing I would encourage, if it's possible, is cooperation amongst different stratas, some sector cooperation. It could have benefits in you guys working together, where you could pool the credits, you have a large amount together, and you could collectively sell those credits and then keep more of that revenue in-house. Instead, where these other aggregators and agents, where they have the place where some people might find them very beneficial and they do can work, they're going to tend to take more revenue from you. Examples of how a strata cooperation type thing could work is, there's a strata that's a specific strata that's leading the way, that's representing multiple stratas, or maybe they're working together and they take turns, and they just have an understanding that they're going to do all the reporting and they're going to divvy out the cash, understanding that there's some administration cost that's going to have to be covered. Another possibility is all stratas are actually just reporting for themselves, but then when it comes together to sell these credits, you are now working together to pool them together, and then one person, or however that works, can transfer those credits over. And with that, that's my presentation. So I guess I'll stop sharing and send it back to Tony.
Thanks, Beneppel. And we're going to have some really juicy questions for you, and I certainly have some juicy questions for you. So let's start, Jennifer, let's start with you with a number of questions that I've tried to group them into a smaller capacity, so we're not here in perpetuity. There you are. You're still with us. Thank you very much. I'm here. So there's a few things here on the questions. I think there's a number of questions there is no answer for yet. And until we see the regulations, and we're just a little reminder to everybody, whenever you see within legislation the word prescribed, it means that there's going to be a regulation that is going to create another level of understanding of that specific part of the act, or a definition in that capacity. So they sometimes say as set out in the regulations, or prescribed by the regulations, or prescription or prescribed. All of them are inferring that there is a regulation that has to be adopted before we go forward. So there's a lot unknown yet, Jennifer, but one of the questions that has repeated itself is would a reasonable request to be satisfied by a strata corporation for charging, especially if they have limited capacity in an older building, be that they can grant permission, but they limit people to a level 1 charger?
Yeah, absolutely. That is certainly an option. But part of what I think is really good about this legislation is it does require the electrical planning report, and presumably that's going to set out the best way to manage it. But yes, I think a level one would be appropriate.
So you said the magic word, electrical planning report, but it also refers to EV planning, EV ready plan, which we have through BC Hydro. Is there a difference between the electrical planning report and an EV ready plan?
Well, I think that's yet to be seen, because we don't know what the regulations are going to require. But my suspicion is the service providers will very quickly make sure that they're consistent.
And we also have the issue with respects to the electrical planning report, taking into consideration more components in buildings. So conversions of makeup air units to heat pumps and air conditioning installed within units, hot water heat pumps that are created to generate and produce hot water, and other types of conversions in buildings. So, it's not just about charging electric vehicles. This is a very holistic approach we're anticipating about building systems themselves.
That's right. I think there's a hint here, because they didn't call it an EV planning report. They called it an electrical planning report. And I think it's really related to the heat dome. We know that they're concerned about more than just EVs.
I think the regulations are going to give us some real interesting times coming ahead. as an option, one of the questions was, rather than granting individuals EV charging stations, what if a Strata corporation set up a bay to enable, at this point, up to 10 stations that could be used by people, as opposed to spreading them out individually throughout the parking garage? If it met the need, would that be a reasonable expectation at this point?
I think that's reasonable. The only challenge there would be, where would the stalls be located? And, if they're in visitor parking, for example, that's definitely a significant change in the use or appearance of common property, but also it could potentially prevent the Strata Corporation from complying with municipal requirements to have a certain amount of visitor parking if owners are parking there.
So one of the questions was, can we defer the electrical report or the electrical plan? The intention of this legislation is that the electrical plan is going to be necessary prior to the alterations or the upgrades. So that's what's really going to trigger this. But who pays for the EV ready, the electrical plan, not the EV ready plan, but the electrical plan, if it's a request of an owner and not the Strata Corporation, who's essentially electrifying their parking garage?
Yeah, the legislation is clear. It's the Strata Corporation that's required to pay. Now, they have provided incentive here. You can do it with a 50% vote if you're using your CRF.
Right. And so it's one of the few expenses, though, when a person makes a specific individual request, that can't be downloaded to the person. This stays the responsibility of the Strata Corporation. And then the other part of that, because we have individuals who request, and Strata Corporation at this point now can't unreasonably refuse installation or an alteration. But if an individual requests, we get into the semantics of who's actually supervising the alterations in the installation, because this is now an individual who's going to be altering the utility of the building in some way with respects to their installation. So, I think this comes down to a practical application as well. Who should really be supervising and monitoring this? And under whose contract and whose insurance and whose liability should this be undertaken?
Well, the legislation is quite permissive. So the Strata Corporation, if they want to be proactive about it, they can, and they can do it themselves, or they can leave it to the owner. But if they do leave it to the owner, they have the ability to make certain requirements that the owner has to fulfill. They can approve the infrastructure, they can approve the contractor. There are all sorts of things that they can have control over.
Well, and not forgetting that this requires an electrical permit, and Technical Safety BC regulates EV charging stations in the province, except for the city of Vancouver, but their regulations are essentially the same. So, you can't sidestep the regulatory requirements on this. The other question, there is a question here about fire safety in buildings. Is there a higher increase of fire risk with electrical vehicles being charged in? And the fire increases have not occurred with electric vehicles. They have actually occurred with bike charging. That's been the problem, but there is an increased risk if vehicles are being improperly charged.
Okay, that's something I was not aware of, but I'll take your advice on that.
And my comment is that I would recommend that a Strata with these concerns talk to their insurance provider, find out what the risks are, talk to the contractors, ensure that that vehicles are being properly charged.
I was going to say dealing with the contractor makes a lot of sense as well. I think, I'm an EV driver, and when we installed our charging station, we had a solid contractor who advised us on it, and I felt quite confident that we weren't going to start a fire.
Yeah. So we have a significant number of older communities, apartment buildings, townhouses, bareland stratas, and their upgrades after they've done their electrical plans. A number of them have already done electrical plans, which we've been referring to as capacity studies for the last few years, but they've already done them. But the cost of the upgrade is so prohibitive that they're not wanting to proceed with it, or it's just economically out of their reach. So, what's a reasonable expectation on this front? Is it reasonable for a Strata to say we can't afford to do this ahead of all of the other upgrades that we have with our buildings?
Well, I certainly can sympathize with that scenario, but I really do believe that the government is trying to incentivize owners to plan in advance. For these strata corporations that feel that they aren't going to be able to afford these costs, continue putting money into your CRF on a regular basis. And that goes for all strata corporations that have repairs. But this is just an additional requirement that we know is not going away.
So Benapel, I'm going to switch over to you because you just kind of made some statements that just kind of opened a landmine of, of potential problems. The one comment you made about strata corporations sharing a joint interest with respects to application for credits and whatnot, there are a lot of significant legal limitations and boundaries between parties with strata corporations and liabilities. I think the real concern that I would have, and certainly I've seen it in the questions in a variety of ways already, the real concern I would have is there going to be some sort of regulatory framework? And I think we're going to need this sooner than later over the people who are essentially going to act as brokers to sell and to negotiate and to recompensate strata corporations for their carbon credits, because I think this opens a door on a lot of potential problems.
Yeah, with regards to the folks who are already in the game representing people, I'm not aware of the regulations coming on them specifically. There is going to be we're looking at routes for transparency, at least, so the people who are being represented should be knowing what the value of their credits are going for. And going forward, that does make sense. These are early days, so I can't speak to though if something is coming on that.
I would strongly recommend that dialogue happen sooner than later. I think we're opening a potential problem there. The other side of this is I would anticipate and certainly have had discussions already with property management brokerages who are going to probably coordinate all of their clients together with respects to filing rebates and compensation. But the fees that are charged for that service will need to be within their service agreements. But I think this is where potentially we get into some real serious problems if there isn't a regulatory framework around this model.
Right. Because the people doing the representing, do you feel like it's going to turn into like some sort of gouging, and is that the real problem? Like, sorry, could you just elaborate on that more so I just capture that better?
Happens in almost every sector of the industry when the opportunity that's unregulated or unmonitored arises. So it's, I think it's something that needs to be paid attention to. Another question that came up is any sense on the connection or the implication of the ending of the government rebate for infrastructure upgrades and strata corporations? That's going to end at exactly the same time Bill 22 is implementing this requirement for infrastructure and for viewing all these upgrades. Is there another plan or another program that's being looked at?
Yeah, so actually, that EV Ready program, I was behind that from my last job, and I'm not there anymore, but I do understand that has come to an end, I guess. I can't speak to if it's going to be coming back. I think that all is up in the air. I do know the rebates for stations specifically I think they're coming back on in a couple of days, but not for the infrastructure for the whole building. That is a TBD still.
Okay. And Jennifer, maybe you can venture in on this as well, but we've now had 2 sites that are new developments where the owner developers have set up EV charging within the developments, but they've created a lease to a third-party company that is going to manage you've seen it, right? We've seen it already. But where the EV delivery and management and the carbon capture credits and everything are being managed by a third company that is going to retain revenues and manage all of that. It gets really complicated when you interconnect this with all the different designations of parking. So whether it's common property or common property with leases or assignments that have been assigned to them, or common property without any leases, or airspace parcels, or limited common property, and rarely are they strata lots. So it has the potential to become even more complicated as we go forward.
For sure. And I think, you know, I don't work for developers, so I'll just express this. It's not, I don't often feel that the approach of developer is a fair approach, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the developers for residential strata corporations anyway have a duty to do a disclosure statement. And so when purchasers are buying in, they'll know whether these kind of arrangements are in place before they buy. So it strikes me as unfair, but I don't know how to manage it.
It's definitely going to be interesting times as we convert this entire utility into now a marketable rebate. I think we're going to see some interesting changes that are occurring. Vinapal, I think that you get just looking back at the questions, I think that the consumer, whether you're in a small strata corporation or if you are in a medium to larger size strata corporation, I think everybody's finding the whole complexity of this a bit overwhelming. Like it's, and I don't think that anybody's surprised that it's a bit complicated, and the amount of labor that's involved to try and deal with this. Is there any sense that this is going to come out with a more simplified system?
Yeah, so yeah, and I do appreciate the burden it can put on people. My opinion is that the actual reporting process is still something you need to do some steps, but it is very straightforward, and we do have support for that to help people with that credit market part. That's another thing I mentioned that's a little more complicated. But we are looking at, as I mentioned, allocation agreements next year, which hopefully will lend itself to people who don't have the capacity, don't have the desire to participate, and they can pass that on to somebody else who, maybe it's their business or whatever. So through that, we're hoping to make that a streamlined process where somebody who either doesn't have capacity, doesn't have the interest, can pass it on. But at the same point, based on your earlier comment, we need to try and make sure that there's transparency there, and there's not like some people who are just going to be taken advantage of, which is a very real possibility, considering a lot of people are just naive in this area, right? They don't have the background. So
yeah, no, exactly. It's an occupation that's coming on the horizon for sure. I think one last, we're coming up to our hour here, Jennifer. One last question, and I'm not, and nobody knows the answer to this yet, but we can speculate a little bit. But an EV planning report isn't about cost. We're anticipating that the electric planning report. The electric planning report is about the anticipation of what capacity a building has for all the potential upgrades, and whether the building can meet that without additional service to the building.
That's my understanding. And I have seen some horror stories with strata corporations that have gone ahead and just sort of willy-nilly allowed EV infrastructure to be installed without planning. And the challenge is that you'll get to your maximum, and then there's a lack of fairness there. So you don't want the early adopters to be the ones who benefit from the failure to plan.
Right. Yeah, and the one last comment on this is that the cost of an upgrade is substantial. If your building or your community, if it's a Bearland or townhouse complex or a high-rise building, and you don't have sufficient capacity to electrify your parking garage or even do a nominal number of upgrades, the costs are incredibly high to do electrical upgrades for your neighborhood. And if your neighborhood requires an upgrade, because you're making the request, you may be responsible through BC Hydro to pay for that cost. So, we've seen cost estimates already of upgrades anywhere from between $250,000 to $1 million for a community upgrade or a building upgrade because there isn't sufficient capacity. So, it sounds like the electric planning report, once we see the definitions and the regulations and have some time on implementation, is probably going to be the first step for most communities as they move forward.
I think so. And that's why I think this legislation is quite positive. I think that it was well considered, that the planning needed to be there before forcing EVs to be everywhere.
Yeah.
Just add to that, yeah. So, because I was involved in the EV Ready plan development and actually did work with some of the folks on this act, supporting them. That planning piece is huge, because when you're doing, a few stations at a time and a few stations at a time, those costs end up being significantly higher than when you're just when you figure it all out in one go and figure out what's the best approach at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we will have additional information in the CHOA Journal, both with respect to Bill 22 and with the carbon capture credits, and explaining that for people. Certainly, if you have additional information, additional questions, I'm not sure anybody knows the answers yet until we have a good sense of what the regulations are going to look like. And we can probably anticipate those regulations, well, let's just say not earlier than October 1st this year, and who knows how late after that. So I think they're complicated regulations that have to be considered, especially with respects to timelines and implementation. So BNAPL, Jennifer, thank you so much. Thanks for your time, and thanks for venturing into kind of the start of this journey that we're going to be going through.
Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And again, everyone, if you have questions, you're welcome to forward them to our office. Use the info@choa.bc.ca. And if it relates to any of the issues, either that BNAPL or Jennifer spoke about, we'll forward those emails right on so that you can speak directly to the parties. And stay tuned. There is much